The courtroom felt cold. The young man sat at the defendant's table, his hands trembling. He was only 17, but he already felt like his life was over. The charges weren't severe, petty theft and trespassing, but in his neighborhood even small crimes could lead to bigger trouble. He glanced around. His mother wasn't there. She had given up on him a long time ago. His friends? Nowhere to be found. He was alone. The judge entered, an older man with sharp eyes. He read the charges, then looked at the boy. There was a long silence. The young man expected the usual speech, how he was a troublemaker, how he was throwing his life away. Instead, the judge asked, "What do you want to do with your life?" The question caught him off guard. He shrugged, not knowing what to say. The prosecutor pushed for jail time. He needs to learn a lesson, they argued. The judge didn't respond right away. He studied the boy again. There was fear in his eyes, but not the kind of fear that criminals had. It was the fear of someone who had never been given a real chance. Then, the judge made a decision. "I'm not sending you to jail," he said. The courtroom went silent. Even the young man looked up in shock. Instead, the judge ordered community service, therapy, and a mentorship program. "This is your only chance," he warned. "Don't waste it." The young man didn't know what to feel. Relief? Confusion? But deep down, for the first time in his life, he had hope. The young man left the courtroom in disbelief. No jail time, no harsh punishment, it didn't seem real. But the judge's words stuck in his head. "This is your only chance, don't waste it." His community service assignment placed him in a small law office. At first he hated it. The work was boring. Organizing papers, running errands, answering phones. It felt like punishment in a different form. But then, something changed. One of the lawyers, Mr. Bennett, noticed him. "You ever think about what happens in a courtroom?" he asked one day. The young man shrugged. "People get sent to jail." Mr. Bennett chuckled. "That's not the whole story. Lawyers don't just put people away. They help. They fight for people who need a second chance, like you." That thought stuck with him. As part of his sentence, he also had to attend therapy. At first, he resisted, barely speaking. But the therapist didn't judge him. "You grew up in a tough place. That doesn't mean you have to stay there," she told him. For the first time, he started talking about his struggles. His absent father, his mother working 2 jobs, the bad influences all around him. It felt strange to open up, but somehow, it helped. Meanwhile, the judge kept tabs on him. Occasionally, he would check in. "Are you keeping your promise?" he asked once, when they crossed paths. The young man hesitated, then nodded. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he knew one thing. He didn't want to go back to his old life. One night, after finishing his shift at the law office, he picked up an old textbook left on a desk. It was about law. Something about it intrigued him, and just like that, a small spark ignited. The young man had made a choice. He wanted more for himself. But wanting something and achieving it were 2 different things. At first, studying was overwhelming. The legal terms were confusing, the concepts felt foreign, and his patience wore thin. He wasn't used to schoolwork. He had barely paid attention in class before. Now, he was trying to understand a world that had once only existed to punish him. At the law office, Mr. Bennett noticed his frustration. "No one gets this stuff overnight," he said. "But if you keep showing up, you'll get there." So he kept showing up. But outside of work, things weren't so easy. His old friends laughed at him. "You think you're some big-time lawyer now?" they mocked. "You ain't built for that." His mother was skeptical. "Law school? Do you know how much that costs?" Doubt crept in. Maybe they were right, maybe he was just fooling himself. Then one night, he saw one of his childhood friends getting arrested. Handcuffed, thrown into the back of a police car. It could have been him. It should have been him. That moment changed everything. He cut ties with his old friends. He spent his nights at the library instead of on the streets. He saved every dollar he earned, knowing that one day he would need it for school. It was exhausting. He worked during the day, studied at night, barely slept. Some days he wanted to quit. But then, he would hear the judge's voice in his head. "This is your only chance." And so he kept going. Slowly things started making sense. Legal arguments, case studies, he began to understand them. He wasn't just reading anymore, he was learning. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged somewhere. And he refused to let go of that feeling. The day he got the acceptance letter, He almost didn't believe it. He read it 3 times, his hands shaking. Congratulations, you have been accepted into law school. He had done it. But getting in was just the first step. Law school was harder than anything he had ever faced. The workload was brutal. The classes moved fast, and the students around him seemed smarter, more prepared. He felt like an outsider. One professor, sensing his struggle, called him after class. Law school isn't about being the smartest, she said. It's about who can push through. So, he pushed through. He worked twice as hard, spending late nights buried in books. The old doubt still crept in sometimes. He thought about quitting more times than he could count. But every time he reached a breaking point, he reminded himself why he started. He remembered his first time in court, sitting in that defendant's chair, feeling hopeless. He thought about the judge, the man who had seen something in him when no one else did. And he thought about the people who didn't get that second chance. That was enough to keep him going. The years passed in a blur of exams, internships, and endless reading. He made connections, built confidence, and learned how to fight, not with fists, but with knowledge. Then, after years of struggle, it happened. He passed the bar exam. Holding the results in his hands, he felt a rush of emotions: relief, pride, disbelief. He had transformed from a scared teenager in a courtroom to a man with a law degree. He wasn't just someone who had escaped his past. He was now someone who could help others escape theirs. His first day as a lawyer felt, dressed in a suit, carrying a briefcase. He walked through the courthouse doors, not as a defendant, not as a scared kid, but as an attorney. The same building that once felt like a prison now felt like a place where he belonged. He had prepared for this moment for years, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. As he stepped into the courtroom, his breath caught in his throat. Sitting on the bench, presiding over the case, was him. The judge. The same man who had given him a second chance. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down. The judge was focused on his papers, unaware of who had just entered. But when he finally looked up, his eyes locked onto the young lawyer. The judge's expression didn't change at first. His sharp eyes studied the man in front of him, just like they had years ago. Then recognition flickered across his face. There was a pause, a long, silent moment of understanding. The young lawyer swallowed hard, then took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Good morning, Your Honor." His voice was steady, confident. The judge didn't speak right away. He simply nodded, his lips pressing together as if holding back words. Then, in a voice softer than expected, he replied, "Good morning, counselor." That was it. No dramatic speech, no emotional exchange. Just 2 words that carried the weight of everything that had happened. The young lawyer took his seat at the defense table, his heart still pounding. He wasn't here as a kid looking for mercy. He was here to fight for someone else. The judge continued with the case as if nothing had happened. But every so often, his eyes would flicker toward the young lawyer, a quiet pride behind them. Neither of them spoke about the past. They didn't need to. The moment itself said everything. The judge had once seen something in a scared young boy. Now, he saw that same boy standing tall, ready to help others the way he had once been helped. And in that courtroom, a silent promise was fulfilled. Years ago, he had sat in a courtroom, terrified of his future. Now he stood in one, fighting for someone else's. The young lawyer had built a career defending those who needed a second chance. He understood them because he had once been them. He knew what it felt like to have no one believe in you. He knew how easy it was to fall into the wrong path. One day he was assigned a case, a teenage boy, 17 years old, caught stealing. As he read through the file, something about it felt familiar. The boy's background, his mistakes, the hopeless look in his mugshot. He saw himself. When the day of the hearing came, the boy sat across from him, arms crossed, eyes full of defiance. "I already know what you're gonna say," the boy muttered. "That I messed up, that I need to do better." The lawyer shook his head. "No," he said. "I want to know what you want to do with your life." The boy blinked, caught off guard. He didn't answer. "I had a judge ask me that question once," the lawyer continued. "It changed everything for me." The boy stared at him, confused. You were? Like you?" The lawyer gave a small smile. "Yeah." The boy didn't speak, but something in his eyes shifted. When the hearing began, the lawyer fought for him. Not just for a reduced sentence, but for a second chance. He argued that the boy wasn't just a criminal, but a kid who had never been given a real choice. The judge listened carefully, and in the end, he ruled in the boy's favor. As the courtroom emptied, the boy sat still, his hands clenched into fists on the table. He watched as the last few people shuffled out. Clerks gathering papers, the judge stepping away, a bailiff giving him a quick glance before walking toward the door. The young lawyer gathered his own papers, ready to leave, when he felt eyes on him. He looked up. The boy was staring. He hesitated, then finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "What happened to you?" His tone wasn't challenging this time, it wasn't defensive, it was something else. Curiosity, maybe even hope. "Did you ever get out?" The lawyer didn't answer right away. He exhaled slowly, glancing around the courtroom, the wooden benches, the judge's bench, the high ceilings. This place had once been a cage to him, a symbol of punishment, of failure, but now it was different. It was where he had found his path. His gaze returned to the boy, who was waiting, shoulders tense as if bracing for disappointment. "Yeah," the lawyer said, his voice steady. "And you can too." The boy's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. His fingers drummed lightly against the table. He looked away, then back at the lawyer, as if searching for a reason to believe him. For the first time since he had been arrested, the sharpness in his expression faded. The anger, the fear, the defiance, it all softened into something new. Possibility. The lawyer didn't press him. He knew that look. He had worn it once, years ago, sitting in that same seat trying to figure out if change was even possible. He gathered his briefcase, gave the boy one last look, and walked toward the door. As he stepped into the hallway, the weight of what had just happened settled in. This wasn't just about one case. It wasn't just about one boy. It was about something bigger. The cycle of second chances would continue.